Welcome to the new episode of History of Revolution. How are you? Hope your week was fine. Today, we're diving deep into Cuba. It's a fascinating place, right? A small island that, nearly 65 years back, basically stared down a global superpower, and they tried something really radical, getting rid of capitalism entirely in the Western Hemisphere.
It really is an essential story in modern history. And to properly get our heads around Cuba's, decades-long fight for survival and why it still faces these big economic hurdles, we need to look past just the famous leaders and the dates. Our mission today, really, is to use a strong theoretical toolkit. We're pulling from Latin American social sciences, things like structuralism, dependency theory, and mixing that with sharp analysis from Marxist thinkers like Samir Amin. We want to understand the forces of what he called global monopoly capitalism.
Exactly. This whole deep dive is about looking at those structural forces, the kind of economic and geopolitical weight that still shapes Cuba's past today, even with its socialist system. We're trying to figure out why a political revolution doesn't just, automatically fix economic dependency, and how these key ideas like structural heterogeneity and imperialist rent actually explain why the island is kind of stuck in this ongoing economic bind.
Yeah, the absolute core of it is this. Cuba won its political freedom, even achieved a sort of ideological delinking from the U.S.-led world, right?
Right.
But its economy, it's still wrestling with massive inherited problems. We need to unpack how this persistence of structural heterogeneity, which basically means this deep, damaging split inside the economy between advanced export bits and underdeveloped local bits, how that keeps Cuba tied to the world system's demands, even though it's politically separate.
Okay, so let's zoom out first. We need the big picture. The Marxist critique of global capitalism. It's the backdrop for everything Cuba did. And for that, we should really start with the work of Samir Amin, the Egyptian Marxist economist. He argued global capitalism isn't exactly thriving.
No, not at all. Amin had this, frankly, pretty stark view of where global capital is at. He said it's not just in a normal downturn, like a recession you recover from.
Yeah.
He argued it's in a deep structural crisis. He called it the L crisis. That's a really key idea for you, the listener, to get.
We usually think of recessions as temporary, maybe like a U crisis. Things go down, then they bounce back using the same old methods. So what's different about this L crisis? And why is it, well, dangerous?
Amin's point was that in an L crisis, the system itself, the established way of doing things, can't generate a recovery. The engine that drove the post-war boom, mass production, consumerism, the whole imperial setup, it's run out of steam. The recovery graph just goes flat, like an L. It points to long-term stagnation, a system stuck in neutral. And this deep stagnation, well, it forces the core capitalist countries to find new, often aggressive ways to keep profits up.
Ah, okay. And that's where the danger comes in, isn't it? Amin said this decline doesn't lead to a peaceful fade-out. Instead, it makes the system, I think his words were, more and more savagely violent. It has to ramp up aggression to keep that imperial dominance of the core intact.
That's precisely it. And it's why Amin brought up that famous line from the Communist Manifesto, the one about class struggle and its final stages leading either to a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin.
Yeah.
For countries on the periphery like Cuba, the stakes are incredibly high. Surviving the stagnation means you have to find a different path, one outside the system's main logic.
Okay, so the global system is structurally aggressive. How do we actually define the economic mechanics of that oppression? That brings us straight to Latin American thinking, the center-periphery model.
Yeah, this model really kicked off in the 1950s. Think Raul Prebisch, the UN Economic Commission for Latin America, ECLA. Prebisch basically threw a wrench in classical economics, which assumed international trade was good for everyone, right?
Right, the old rising tide lifts all boats idea. What did he find that challenged that?
Prebisch and the structuralists show the global economy isn't symmetrical at all. It's structurally divided. There's a center, the rich, industrialized countries, and a periphery, the developing nations, like Cuba back then. And peripheral countries tend to specialize in exporting raw materials. Primary goods, think sugar, nickel, coffee. Meanwhile, they have to import the complex manufactured stuff from the center.
And the key issue is what happens to the prices over time.
Mm-hmm.
The value of those exports versus imports.
That's the absolute kicker. The terms of trade systematically worsen for the periphery. Prices for raw materials tend to stagnate or fluctuate wildly, while the prices for machinery, technology, manufactured goods, they just keep rising. So the periphery ends up having to export more and more raw stuff just to buy the same amount of advanced imports. It's a constant drain of wealth. This structural disadvantage guarantees dependency, because it cripples the periphery's ability to build its own tech base, its own innovation.
Okay, so structuralism shows the unfair trade dynamics. How does dependency theory, thinking of people like Marini, Dos Santos, how does that take the analysis further? Does it look inside the peripheral country?
Exactly. Dependency theory goes deeper. It says the problem isn't just external trade relations. It's that the economic and social structures within the peripheral nations themselves are basically set up to serve the core's interests. It looks at how internal patterns, like that structural heterogeneity, SH we mentioned, actively keep this global system going. SH means the internal economy is broken up. You might have these high-tech export zones, totally disconnected from the rest of the country's low-tech, often subsistence-level economy. It's internally disarticulated.
Right, internally fragmented. And speaking of extracting value, let's bring Samir Amin back in here. His concept of imperialist rent from accumulation on a world scale that was back in 1970. How is this rent actually extracted? Is it just like normal profit?
It's different. Imperialist rent is this extra value, this differential appropriation, siphoned off by what Amin termed generalized monopoly capital. Now, monopoly capital isn't just about big companies. It's about capital being so dominant, it can basically force almost all other production, even state companies in the periphery, to act like its subcontractors. The core controls the crucial levers: the cutting-edge technology, the global shipping and logistics, the financial markets that set prices.
So let's say Cuba mines nickel. The core capitalist powers control the tech to mine it efficiently, the ships to move it, the markets where the price is decided. So the actual value created by the Cuban worker isn't fully realized in Cuba.
Precisely. The lion's share of the value gets sucked towards the core through these global mechanisms, not necessarily just at the point of production. It becomes this rent paid to the monopolies controlling the system. It really confirms the Marxist view. Capitalism needs imperialism to expand, and wealth systematically flows from periphery to core, which means, logically, any country trying to genuinely break free has to pursue delinking.
Wait a second, though. Delinking sounds like cutting yourself off completely. I mean, talk about that in 1985, right? But you just said countries need trade. How can Cuba delink and set its own terms without becoming totally isolated, ending up in autarky? Isn't that just economic suicide?
That's the crucial distinction Amin made, in delinking, towards a polycentric world. Delinking is absolutely not autarky. That would be disastrous. Delinking is more of a political and economic stance. It's refusing to let your local development priorities, things like feeding your own people, building up key domestic industries, be dictated by the demands of the global capitalist system, by the need to maximize export profits above all else. It means saying, okay, world, we need to trade, but these are our non-negotiable internal priorities. You have to deal with us on these terms. It's about flipping the script, setting your own rules of engagement. Okay, so understanding why the Cuban Revolution almost instinctively went for this idea of delinking, even before Amin really laid it out, means looking at Cuba's history. It was steeped in dependency. Ever since 1898, after the Spanish-American War, Cuba was essentially a playground for U.S. capitalist expansion, a textbook peripheral economy.
Right. U.S. companies basically ran the show, especially with sugar and later tourism, made the whole island incredibly vulnerable to whatever happened with sugar prices globally.
Exactly. And that economic dependency had a huge political consequence. The fight for real national independence couldn't be separated from the fight against class oppression. Why? Because the local Cuban elite, the bourgeoisie, was completely tied up with, dependent on, the U.S. ruling class. They weren't independent actors.
So you're saying the fight for the nation was the class struggle in Cuba's specific case, because the local ruling class wasn't truly national?
The sources really bear this out. Even decades before Castro, figures like Julio Antonio Melo, one of the founders of the first Cuban Communist Party back in the 1920s, they argued that real national liberation had to be socialist. They saw that the local bourgeoisie was just too weak, too compromised by U.S. ties to actually carry out a full democratic national revolution.
Yeah.
You couldn't kick out U.S. imperialism without also dealing with its local business partners.
Okay, fast forward to the revolution itself. When Castro's movement took power in 1959, they didn't immediately say, we're building socialism, did they?
No, not explicitly at first. It really started with the attack on the Moncada barracks in '53. And they came to power based on a program of, national and democratic reforms. Things like land reform, taking over utilities, pushing for social justice. But this is where you see that idea of permanent revolution kind of playing out. As they consistently tried to implement those democratic reforms, they immediately slammed into U.S. imperial interests. Land reform threatened U.S. sugar companies. Nationalizations hit U.S. utilities.
And that conflict, the pushback from the U.S. The sanctions, the Bay of Pigs, it basically forced the revolution's hand, didn't it? It sped up the whole process, nationalizations got more radical,
Yeah.
and eventually defending the initial democratic goals led them straight to abolishing capitalism altogether.
Absolutely. The sources suggest they ended up ditching capitalism precisely because of that escalating conflict with U.S. imperialism. They quickly realized that true self-determination meant a complete systemic break.
Let's talk about the ideology then. Because the Cuban model wasn't just a copy-paste of Soviet Marxism. Grandma highlights Fidel Castro's key role in blending Marxism with the ideas of José Martí. Who was Martí and why was he so important?
Martí is like the George Washington of Cuba, the founding father of independence. Crucially, he spent a lot of time living in the U.S. He saw American expansionism up close, understood its aggressive nature really deeply. He didn't just see the U.S. as a big neighbor. He saw it as central to the rise of modern imperialism. His whole life's work was dedicated to achieving what he called world equilibrium, basically, a global anti-imperialist balance to counter U.S. power. He saw Cuba as pivotal in that fight.
So Martí brought the passionate anti-imperialism, the defense of Cuban identity and sovereignty, and Marxism provided the framework, the tools to analyze class, the state, the economy scientifically.
Exactly. It was a synthesis. It took universal Marxist concepts and grounded them in the very specific, unique history of Cuba, a history shaped by slavery, then neo-colonial dependency. This blend allowed the revolution to appeal both to nationalist sentiment and claim a scientific socialist path, which was vital for a third world country trying such a radical transformation.
Okay, so they achieve this political break. They break with the U.S., the main actor, enforcing what some call the coloniality of power. But did the economic dependency just vanish? The critique suggests they kind of just swapped patrons.
Well, that's the really complex and controversial part about the Cold War years. After 1961, Cuba throws its lot in with real socialism, the Soviet bloc.
Right.
Now, this was absolutely vital for survival. It provided an economic lifeline, huge amounts of aid, guaranteed markets for sugar, cheap oil. But critics argue, and some sources point this out, that the fundamental structure of economic dependence didn't change, it just readapted. It created what one source calls an illusion of development.
An illusion because the state took control, planned everything, but the underlying economic structure relying on exporting primary goods didn't fundamentally change.
Precisely. The reliance on Soviet aid and these special trade deals, while necessary, arguably perpetuated that structural heterogeneity, SH. Instead of being dependent on sugar exports to the U.S. market, they became dependent on sugar and nickel exports to the Soviet bloc, often at prices that were politically inflated, not set by a real market. So the underlying issue, the differential appropriation of wealth, the peripheral economic role, just shifted its geopolitical address, you could say, from Washington, D.C. to Moscow. It didn't fundamentally rewire Cuba's productive engine. And that leads us right into the internal problems, the self-inflicted wounds, perhaps, of that centralized socialist model Cuba adopted during the Cold War. Some analyses point to key policy mistakes. These often stemmed from, well, an ideological over-reliance on the state's ability to do everything and maybe a bit of disdain for any kind of market activity.
What specific mistakes are we talking about here? What held back development despite the socialist goals?
Well, one major thing was this exclusive focus on state actors. There was this deep suspicion, often framed in Leninist terms, of small businesses, private property, any kind of entrepreneurship outside the state plan. It was often seen as a slippery slope to capitalism, right? So gradually, most private ownership was eliminated. The state's role in planning and running everything was massively overvalued. The consequence? It seems to have really slowed down the development of endogenous capacities, the ability of Cubans themselves on the ground to innovate, start things, build wealth locally.
So the state tried to plan it all, but in doing so, it maybe stifled the organic innovation and drive that was already there or could have developed, created a big disconnect.
It led to what is arguably the central paradox of Cuba's development. It's really quite unique. On one hand, Cuba achieved truly remarkable human development HD indicators. We're talking universal access to high-quality education, world-class healthcare, incredible social achievements. But, and this is the big but, the sources highlight the system, fundamentally failed to connect that amazing human capital, those skilled people, to overcoming the old peripheral economic structure. They didn't manage to build strong internal productive links between different sectors.
Wow, so it's like having this incredibly powerful, well-maintained engine, the educated population, but connecting it to a really old, inefficient transmission system. They trained brilliant doctors, engineers, scientists, but the economy was mostly set up to efficiently produce sugar, nickel, tourism services, and state bureaucracy jobs.
That's a very good way to put it. It's almost the definition of how structural heterogeneity played out in Cuba. You get these advanced pockets like biotech, top-tier medicine, right alongside, say, really inefficient, low-tech domestic food production. The systemic failure was not linking the creation of that world-class human potential to widespread technological progress, productivity gains, and development across the board domestically. Innovation just got sidelined in many areas.
And what happens politically or socially when those high social achievements, the high expectations from education to healthcare, bump up against low economic productivity, low wages, limited goods?
Yeah, you hit the constraint of consumption capacity.
Hmm.
In today's world, rightly or wrongly, people's sense of well-being is often tied to what they can consume, to rising real incomes. Cuba's low productivity meant slow growth in real wages. So the social gains, the high HD, started clashing with rising expectations, fueled partly by comparisons with the capitalist world. This creates a structural tension, right? Social expectations racing ahead of the economy's ability to deliver.
It sounds like a recipe for frustration. You mentioned earlier that a key factor dragging down productivity was the combination of full employment and relatively equal incomes. That sounds fair on the surface, but why did it hinder improvement?
It's a tricky one. The issue was that the wage system often wasn't closely linked to how much someone actually produced, or their skill level, or technological contribution. The priority was job security for everyone, which is laudable in itself. But it often led to what economists call labor-hoarding state companies, keeping way more workers than they actually needed. This made it hard to shut down inefficient operations or shift resources effectively. The sources point out that any surplus generated by state firms often got immediately channeled into funding the broad social programs or servicing debt, rather than being reinvested back into the company or rewarding workers for boosting productivity.
So if I was a super productive worker or engineer, my pay might not be that different from someone doing a much less demanding or skilled job in another state enterprise. The incentive structure for individuals and for enterprises to really push efficiency wasn't strongly there.
That seems to be a core part of the analysis. The system's accumulation capacity, its ability to generate and reinvest surplus for growth, stagnated partly because of this structure. It was a structural choice, prioritizing social equity and stability over dynamic efficiency. Some analyses call this the heresy of socialism, in practice failing to build efficient, competitive internal strategies and relying instead on external support, like from the Soviets. The result was that the internal productive structure stayed stubbornly peripheral, despite the revolutionary government.
It really hammers home how tough it is. Even with a genuine commitment to social justice, you're still fighting the undertow of global capitalism and the legacy of that inherited economic structure, especially if your internal model has these kinds of disconnections. By the way, if you liked and interested so far, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. It's really important for us to continue the series.
Yeah, and those internal contradictions we've been talking about, that gap between high social development and low economic productivity, they were just brutally exposed when the Soviet Union started to unravel. Gorbachev's reforms in the mid-'80s, perestroika and glasnost, they were the writing on the wall. Then came the final collapse in 1991. Suddenly, Cuba's main political ally, economic sponsor and trading partner, was gone. Poof.
Overnight, basically, they lost something like 85% of their foreign trade, lost their cheap oil, spare parts, everything. It must have been an absolutely terrifying shock to the system.
Oh, the special period in the early 90s was devastating. We're talking about the economy grinding to an almost complete halt. Massive shortages of food, fuel, medicine, power outages lasting hours and hours. People's salaries became almost meaningless because there was nothing to buy. It was a genuine fight for survival.
Now, before the final Soviet collapse, Fidel Castro had already reacted quite strongly to Gorbachev's reforms with his own policy called rectification, right?
That's right. Rectification started in the mid-1980s, and it was fascinating because it went in the opposite direction of perestroika. While Gorbachev was introducing market elements, Castro was trying to create a purer, more authentically Cuban socialism. He actually closed down some of the limited market experiments that had been allowed, like farmers' markets. There was a re-centralization of control and a re-emphasis on ideology, volunteer labor, and Fidel's own charismatic leadership. It was a defense mechanism, really.
And despite the absolute horror of the special period, the Cuban Revolution did survive. Unlike the regimes in Eastern Europe, it didn't collapse. The government pointed to this as proof that the revolution was genuinely popular, that it had deep roots.
It certainly showed a remarkable resilience and national cohesion, no doubt about it. But the crisis also threw into sharp relief some long-simmering internal ideological debates. One key one involved critiques of Che Guevara's revolutionary strategy, often called Foquism.
Okay, let's try and unpack that critique carefully. Some sources frame Guevara's ideas, Foucaultism, as being maybe a bit idealistic, perhaps even petty bourgeois, and contrast it with a more orthodox, class-based, Marxist-Leninist approach.
Right. Foquism comes largely from Guevara's own experience in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, which was, of course, successful. He wrote about it in Guerrilla Warfare in 1961. It basically has three core ideas, or postulates. One, popular forces, like a guerrilla army, can defeat a regular army. Two, you don't necessarily have to wait for all the objective conditions for revolution to be perfect. The insurrection itself, the foco or focus point of armed struggle, can help create those conditions. And three, in underdeveloped Latin America, the main battleground is the countryside.
And that strategy clearly worked in Cuba in '59. But what's the counter-argument from a more traditional Marxist perspective, especially concerning the role of working class versus the guerrilla vanguard?
The main critique is that Foucaultism risks falling into idealism, putting too much faith in the power of will and heroism and voluntarism, ignoring the importance of objective material conditions and the readiness of the masses. Critics argue it overemphasizes the role of the vanguard, the small group of armed revolutionaries, the great men, almost, rather than the collective action of the working class and peasantry organized and led by a political party. The core Leninist idea is, without revolutionary theory, no revolutionary movement, but also, fundamentally, that the liberation of the working class must be the act of the working class itself.
So the criticism is that Foucaultism might see the masses more as supporters or beneficiaries of the revolution led by the heroic Foucault, rather than the primary conscious agents of historical change, organized through their own party structures.
That's a fair summary of the critique. It also questions Foucaultism's tendency to see armed struggle as the primary method almost all the time, rather than just one possible tactic subordinate to the broader political strategy and leadership of a working-class party. And proponents of this critique often point to the failures of many other attempts to replicate the Cuban model using Foucault's tactics across Latin America in the 60s and 70s, suggesting that victory requires more than just a heroic guerrilla band.
The fall of the Soviet Union also prompted another important theoretical lens to be applied, this time from the Trotskyist tradition, regarding what kind of state Cuba actually was.
Yes, Trotskyists generally saw the Cuban Revolution positively, as a huge step forward. It got rid of capitalism, nationalized property, raised class consciousness, all progressive moves. However, they also noted the lack of direct political control by the workers themselves through democratic councils or Soviets. So they applied the theory of the degenerated worker state.
Okay, for someone not familiar with that term, what does degenerated worker state actually mean in practice? What's the core idea?
It means that while the economic foundations are socialist, the state owns the means of production, which is key. The political superstructure isn't controlled by the workers democratically. Instead, power is held by bureaucracy, or in Cuba's case, arguably a charismatic leader and the party apparatus, which operates somewhat independently of direct working-class control. Trotskyists see this as an unstable transitional state. The bureaucracy defends the nationalized property against capitalism, which is good, but it also prevents genuine workers' democracy. The theory predicts such a state can't last forever. It will either move forward through a political revolution by the workers to establish democracy towards real socialism, or it will inevitably degenerate backwards, politically and economically, towards capitalism. It's seen as inherently contradictory.
Right, so this internal political and economic tension, the flaws that the shock of the Soviet collapse laid bare, this is really the context for understanding Cuba's struggles and choices today. Hey, listener, do you have any other idea or question about this? Please write in comments.
Absolutely. So as Cuba clawed its way out of the special period and tried to find its footing back in the global economy after 1991, two fundamental problems just became crystal clear. They've shaped everything since. First, a chronic, deep dependence on imports, especially food and fuel. And second, extreme vulnerability to the volatile prices it gets for its few main exports. Still the same old story in some ways.
And that constant struggle to pay for essential imports, that trade deficit, forced them to get creative about earning foreign currency, didn't it? Looking for revenue streams beyond just selling sugar or nickel.
Yeah, they pursued several avenues. There was a big push to encourage remittances from Cubans living abroad, especially in the U.S. Then there were these politically driven deals, like the famous one with Venezuela exchanging Cuban doctors and teachers for heavily subsidized oil under Chavez. That was crucial for a while. But perhaps the most significant and revealing strategy has been the massive exportation of intensive services.
Right. Sending brigades of Cuban doctors, engineers, teachers, sports trainers all over the world, and the government collects the hard currency payments. It's basically exporting Cuba's human capital.
It's been a huge success in terms of bringing in revenue, absolutely vital for balancing the books. But here's where we see that core contradiction persisting. They're using the fantastic results of their social investment, their highly skilled people, primarily as a way to earn foreign exchange, rather than fully harnessing that talent to drive internal development, to build those missing productive links inside Cuba. The social capacity is being used to plug the external gap, not fundamentally transform the internal economy.
And this is happening at the same time that Cuba is cautiously, maybe reluctantly, opening up more to foreign investment, even potentially from the U.S., which must create huge ideological challenges, right? Given the revolution was built on opposing U.S. imperialism.
It's a massive shift. The whole strategy now heavily involves attracting foreign direct investment, FDI. You have the ongoing update to the socialist economic model, and critically, the 2014 Foreign Investment Law, Law 118. The goal is clear: get access to capital, technology, and markets that Cuba desperately lacks domestically.
And given that chronic lack of internal savings, which is tied back to the low productivity issues we discussed, they really don't have much choice but to look externally for financing, do they? But where is this new FDI heading? Does it risk just repeating old patterns?
Well, that's the concern highlighted in some analyses. Law 118 puts a lot of emphasis on attracting investment into sectors like tourism, energy, especially renewables, but also potentially oil exploration, and mining. These are mostly primary sector or service activities, and this reinforces a trend seen elsewhere in Latin America: reprimarization, moving back towards reliance on raw materials and basic services rather than building complex, higher value-added industries. Why? Because it's often easier and less risky for foreign capital to invest in a new hotel or an existing mine than to build, say, a whole new manufacturing supply chain from scratch.
So bringing in foreign money, even with state controls, could ironically end up locking Cuba more firmly into that peripheral role, exacerbating the internal imbalances, the SH. And what about how workers are hired in these new foreign invested ventures?
That's another really tricky point, touching on the core socialist principles. Law 118 is quite specific. Foreign companies don't hire Cuban workers directly. It says there shall be no free hiring of the labor force. Instead, the foreign company has to go through a state-run employment agency. This agency hires the Cubans and contracts them out to the foreign firm. The wages are supposed to be linked to efficiency and the value generated.
Okay, so the state acts as an intermediary. But what's the critique of that system? How could it still lead to exploitation?
The critique is that the state, being desperate for foreign currency, effectively ends up supplying highly educated, skilled, but relatively low-cost labor to international capital. The wage the Cuban worker actually receives from the state agency is often reported to be only a fraction of the hard currency fee the foreign company pays the agency. So it potentially mirrors that old dependency dynamic. The value created by Cuban labor is partially appropriated, not by the foreign company directly, but via the state intermediary acting under intense economic pressure. It reinforces the cheap, skilled labor nation.
Wow, so after all this time, all the struggle, Cuba is facing this fundamental dilemma again. Which brings us back full circle to Samir Amin and delinking. How does this idea apply now? What would real delinking look like today?
Well, Amin's vision for genuine delinking, laid out in works like Globalisation and its Alternative, is pretty demanding. It requires fundamental shifts that Cuba is still grappling with. First, he argued, you need to build a modern, integrated industrial system focused primarily on meeting internal popular demand, what your own people need, not just what the export market wants. Second, modernize your own agriculture, especially family farming, to achieve genuine food sovereignty, ending that dependence on imports. And third, crucially, you need effective planning to link industry and agriculture together, creating internal synergies.
So in essence, build your economy from the inside out, driven by your own people's needs and capabilities.
Exactly. The absolute key is using those incredible social capacities that human capital Cuba has invested in for decades to drive internal productivity, technological progress, and innovation. That's how you gain the strength to regulate the market on your own terms, to control how you engage with globalization rather than being controlled by it. But the dilemma Cuba faces today is immense. How do you resist the pressures of global capital, limit that extraction of wealth, while needing huge amounts of foreign investment just to keep the lights on and meet basic consumption, needs to avoid social unrest. It's walking a tightrope.
So we've covered a lot of ground. From Cuba's deep roots in dependency, through the revolution, unique ideology, the Soviet era with its internal economic contradictions, the shock of the special period, and now these current challenges of reinsertion and potential new dependencies. I think the big takeaway is that Cuba's ongoing struggle really shows something profound for any country trying to break free from the global periphery. Political independence, even achieved through a radical revolution, just doesn't automatically solve those deep-seated structural economic problems, the dependency, the internal fragmentation imposed by global capitalism.
That's right. The persistence of those conditions, the low productivity, the reliance on imports, that failure to fully connect the amazing social achievements with economic dynamism that remains the revolution's central, ongoing challenge. Cuba's future really seems to hang on this question. Can it finally manage to integrate those hard-won social capacities into a truly productive, endogenous economic strategy, one that can genuinely push back against the logic of global monopoly capital?
And if they don't manage that transition, if the focus shifts too much towards just trying to satisfy immediate consumer demands, perhaps by opening up more rapidly without fixing the underlying structure, what's the ultimate risk to the legacy of the revolution?
The biggest danger, mentioned in the source material, is what's termed a random regression in development. That's a stark phrase. It means Cuba could end up sacrificing some of its incredible social gains, the universal health care, the education system, the relative social equality, in a scramble to meet consumer expectations driven by global capitalist standards without achieving the necessary deep structural economic changes. That kind of path would represent a profound retreat from the revolution's original goals. It could lead to new inequalities, differentiated levels of failure within society. And ironically, it might end up validating the very critiques the revolution sought to overcome, that capitalism inherently fails to deliver equitable development in the periphery. Failing to achieve genuine delinking in the end risks undermining everything that was fought for over decades.
A really critical juncture for Cuba, then. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been incredibly insightful. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. See you on next episode, comrades. Bye-bye.